Sweden. Once the greatest counter-striking nation of all time, with incredible achievements across 1.6, Source, and CSGO. Many say Sweden is the home of Counter-Strike.
Sweden makes a great spiritual home for Counter-Strike, mainly because it is the essence of Counter-Strike, right?
With some of the most iconic players and organisations throughout the history of the game. However, in recent years, the Swedish scene has fallen off, with very little impact at the very top of Counter-Strike. This region won 4 of the first 6 majors, with numerous other S-tier tournaments to boot, Fnatic claiming 3, and NIP claiming 1. However, since that golden era, Sweden has been unable to perform at the very top, with their last S-tier win being Fnatic at DreamHack Malmö 2019. Today, only one Swede made it to the most recent major in Copenhagen, Roland. So what happened to Sweden? How did they go from the most successful region, dominating the scene, to a trophy cabinet full of dust? Let's first look at when Sweden was on top, for perspective on how far the region has fallen. In 2012, when CSGO was released, the CS scene was split into 3 different communities: 1.6, Source, and the brand new CSGO. Most were apprehensive about the new title and didn't migrate for the first few months, but NIP, the iconic Swedish org founded in 2000, announced their comeback with the release of the new title, consisting of a new lineup of Forest, Get Right, Freiburg, Verflaren, and Exist. It was with this version of NIP at the very inception of CSGO when the greatest feat in CS history was achieved, a map win streak of 87-0. This just showed how truly dominant Swedish players were at this point in Counter-Strike's history. Going into the very first CSGO major, most regions had made the switch to the newest title, leaving their old 1.6 and Source scenes behind. However, even with the increased competition, NIP was still well and truly the favourite leading into this major. And it wasn't just NIP representing Sweden. There were 3 other teams in addition to NIP. SK, LGB, and of course, Fnatic, making a total of 19 Swedish players out of the 80 total players in attendance. All 10 players in the grand final of that very first major in Jönköping were Swedish, with Fnatic upsetting NIP. But that's besides the point. For the first 6 majors in the life of CSGO, there was a Swedish team in the grand final of every single one. 2015 was truly the peak of Swedish CS. The environment was now far more competitive than when the game first launched in 2012, with larger prize pools and huge international focus on Counter-Strike. But still, the Swedes were consistently seen making the distance, with Fnatic taking both majors in Cologne and Katowice. Sweden has never returned to those heights. By 2016, the Swedes were beginning to fall behind, mainly due to the resurgence of a certain other region. The Swedes were struggling to make the deep runs and victories they'd been consistently achieving over the first decade of Counter-Strike competition. Many theorise this is due to the playstyle of NIP and Fnatic. They had immense firepower and great star fraggers.
Was a nerd, like, he's over there with his laptop, like, anti-strangles, haha, like, that's...
But the game was transforming into a more tactical beast, and this is where teams led by IGLs like Fallen leading SK and Luminosity, and Glaive leading Astralis became far more successful. By 2019, most people had given up on Fnatic and NIP. While there was an occasional playoff run, like NIP at Katowice 2019, Sweden was no longer anywhere near the most dominant region anymore. Most would agree Denmark, at the time, and still to this day, is the most influential and dominant region. During 2019, even historically less successful regions like Australia and Finland were producing S-tier tournament finalist teams. By the end of 2019, the original squads of the famous Swedish teams had fractured. Get Right had left NIP, Olof had left Fnatic for FaZe, Flusher had left Fnatic for around a year to explore a failed international project at Cloud9, and the old guard of Sweden seemed to have lost their flair. It was adapt or die, and while there were pickups like Rez from NIP and Brolan by Fnatic, the majority of talent coming out of Sweden was not up to the same caliber that other regions were producing. And the older legends in JW, Flusher, Get Right and Forest just couldn't keep up. You may be saying, yes sure, the Swedish orgs were falling off, but 2019 and 2020 was a time when international squads were becoming more common. However, Individually, Swedes were also falling off. In 2013, Sweden had 6 players in the top 20, with Getright and Forrest taking out the top 2 spots. In 2014, Sweden had 7 players in the top 20, once again with Getright number 1, but Flusher number 2. In 2015, 6 players again, and Olofmeister taking out the number 1 spot. But in 2016, they began to see a noticeable drop-off in not only tournament results, but also in individual performances. Only 5 players made the top 20, and they were further down the list in the first 3 years. By 2017, there was only 1 Swede in the top 20. Olofmeister ranked 19th. Today, we are now at a point where Fnatic has become an international roster, and NIP is ranked 25th in the world and is not taken seriously. Behind NIP, the next highest Swedish org is Johnny Speeds, ranked 64th. So how did this fall from being the most dominant region with 23% of players from the first major to having 0 representation at the most recent major in Copenhagen? I think a key reason for this has been the changing environment of the game. In the early days, the game was more about pure firepower, with limited utility and tactics compared to the way the game is played today. Both NIP and Fnatic were also slower to pick up and develop younger talent than other teams were able to do. Besides Brolan, Sweden does not really have any key star players that have entered the scene in the past 5 years. Regions like France, Denmark, Germany, and CIS have done far more for rising stars, developing them into weapons of mass destruction. A final point is now everyone has equitable access to the internet, and means anyone with a PC can pick up the game and begin to grind. However, back in the 90s and early 2000s, Sweden had one of the most robust internet infrastructures, meaning Swedes could play from home, while players from other countries had to play from internet cafes. This gave Sweden a first mover's advantage that is now dissolved. But, as in any sport, there are ups and downs for teams and regions, as it is impossible for perfection to be maintained forever. Dynasties end, and perhaps the fall of Sweden was simply inevitable. So what is next for the region of Sweden in Counter-Strike? While there is no one currently at the top, there is still opportunity for development in the region. NIP has its academy roster, JW is heading up Eyeballers, and with the experience he has, there could be some younger talent that comes through that he could develop into a star. Because of the history the region has, and all of the esport infrastructure and support networks that are available from the 25 year of Swedish players in Counter-Strike, I believe over the life of CS2, we will begin to see a resurgence of Sweden in Counter-Strike. I can't wait to see what happens over the next 5 to 10 years. Tuck.